So this kind of dovetails into what we're talking about, which is as we begin to move towards a thoughtful strategy on how to preserve the bladder, I think it's important that we think about what we're going to be comparing that to, which is really the achievements that we've made with cystectomy and diversion. So I proudly put up my paltry disclosure here. So apropos, with the passing of this gentleman recently, Dr. Skinner, he's really been one of the giants who helped solidify the surgical tenets for cystectomy and invasive disease, which is managing the perivesical tissues and the regional lymph nodes as part of a strategy of optimizing local and then subsequent distant control. When we don't do a good job, we run into this, which is the local recurrence related issue. This was in a group of over 2,200 cystectomies that we recently looked at and found about 300 recurrences. And interesting, it followed along the pattern of associated variables that increased the risk, high path stage, positive margins, positive lymph nodes, and some variants. But we did a real detailed analysis as to where these nodes were, or these recurrences were coming up, and the majority of them were actually in the nodal packets that were left behind. Again, clarifying the importance of doing a thorough lymph node dissection as well. So to Yair's point, which is how effective is surgery? Well, if we go back now to data like this is a large group of 15 centers looking at the effectiveness of cystectomy alone. So no neoadjuvant therapy, they receive no adjuvant therapy. This is basically just surgery. And you can see in a large number of patients, if you got organ-confined disease, we cure the vast majority. In fact, if you have extravesical extension of the primary tumor, but your nodes are negative, over 60% of those patients are going to be cleared with surgery alone. In the node positive group, obviously they do significantly worse, but interestingly, without any adjuvant therapy, about a third of those patients can also be rendered disease-free. So how effective is, well, let me just, move this forward here. So this is some work that actually Dr. Almasi had helped put together when he was at Memorial. You could see in the lower panel there on the left, this was sort of the traditional look at outcomes in patients with both localized and sort of regional disease. And their outcomes were sort of stubbornly stable for many, many years. And we sought to evaluate whether or not there were some improvements in the most recent 20 years. And so what we did was we looked at a group of patients treated in the late 90s compared to patients in the early 2000s to follow and see how they did. Importantly, when we compared sort of the older to the newer cohort, it was important to evaluate whether there was a stage shift. We know how critically important stage is on outcome. And if we're treating more patients with early stage disease, that's obviously going to skew the data. We really didn't see a stage shift. The percentage of patients really with no more than T1 disease remained at or below a third overall. So no major stage shift. What did change though over time was in the early 2000s with the SWOG data that came out, neoadjuvant platinum therapy began to be used more. And you can see over time, after 2003, there was a pretty dramatic increase to the ceiling, which is probably about 60% of patients who are going to be able to get platinum-based therapy. That led to an improvement in pathologic complete response rates. We even lowered some of the soft tissue surgical margins, although they were pretty low to begin with. We also found that the thoroughness of the lymph node dissection as measured by the number of nodes reported started to go up. Why is that important? Well, in every way we've looked at this over the decades, the more thorough your dissection is, the better the outcomes are. So this is important. So here's kind of the punchline. Over the last couple of decades, if we compare the outcomes of patients who received cystectomy prior to 2000, you now have an 8% improved recurrence-free survival rate, so such that only now about a third of our patients at 5 years are recurring. Disease-specific death rates have dropped significantly from about a third of those patients dying of their disease down to now about a quarter. Okay, that's a pretty high bar. This is all comers too. And overall survival now you can see as well the 50% at 5-year number, which is sort of the traditional comparison benchmark, no longer stands. It's closer now to at least 60, 65%, and this is seen across a variety of surgical series. So here's the cancer benchmark when we begin to start thinking about longer-term cancer-specific outcomes when we start sparing the bladder. The 1-year disease intact, metastatic free survival rates that some of the bladder sparing protocols are written for at this point probably are not adequate. And here's the benchmark that we need to be thinking about. But obviously, we also have to consider the cost, which is primarily related to complications. So when you do a good detailed analysis of your series, what you find is that probably about 2/3 of your patients are going to undergo or experience some sort of a complication. The important part, though, perioperatively, is that the majority of surgical series have shown that only about 1 in 5 patients, about 20%, experience a high-grade complication. The vast majority of the complications that happen perioperatively are grade 1 or 2. Up until the SWOG study, which was a limited versus extended node dissection, that 20% number was pretty consistent, whether it was open or robot, such as in the Memorial series, the RAZOR trial, which was also open versus robot still. There was a large German extended versus limited lymph node dissection. They also found in the 20% range for high grade. It was really just the SWOG study that somehow managed to report doubling of that high grade complication rate. So the question is, what is the quality of life hit by removing the bladder? And the perception is that from baseline, there's large and sustained decreases in quality of life once the bladder's been removed, that the quality of life is likely to get worse over time, leading to dramatic long-term consequences, and that probably the elderly patients that we're seeing are the ones who are at greatest risk for these sustained drops. And because of this perception, whether real or not, this has led a lot of people to seek non-cystectomy options, sometimes to their detriment if they don't receive definitive therapy at all. So what we sought out to do was probably the most onerous quality of life study in patients undergoing cystectomy. It took us several years to get this done, but we enrolled 550 patients, got several baselines, and then followed them out basically out to the 2-year mark. And that's Matt Clements, one of our previous fellows who helped with this work as well. We used a battery of standardized measures in order to evaluate a whole series of domains in quality of life to try to be as comprehensive as possible. And then on top of that, we added an interview technique as well to obtain information that may not have been obtained from the questionnaires. Here's the punchline. Now, we separated continent diversion versus the ileal conduit group, not for direct comparisons here about how the diversions perform. These are very different groups of patients. At our shop, if you get an ileal conduit, you're 15 years older than the patients that got a continent diversion. You're less likely to have gotten perioperative chemotherapy because of renal function and comorbidities. So this is the older, sicker group of patients versus really kind of the younger, healthier group. But if you just look individually at them, what you see is that the perceptions really don't meet reality, right? This is patient-reported outcome data. There is no dramatic decrease. Even in the early perioperative period, when you look at global quality of life, this is the QOL QC30, you don't really see that major hit that's perceived. Recovery essentially occurs by 12 months, and you can see that these quality of life returning to baseline are maintained out to the 2-year mark. Now, what about the oldest group of patients here? So now you have age as a continuum here on the x-axis. The mountain behind is basically the distribution of patients based upon age. So if you look at the group of older patients, 80 years and older, the blue lines here are the 3-month evaluations, and the orange lines are the 12 months. And what you can see is that even in the oldest group of patients selected for surgery, you still do not see global dramatic changes in quality of life. Okay. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some changes, right? Physical functioning, we know will take a dip in that early perioperative period, but it does follow that recovery pattern out from 9 months to a year, whether we see it in the younger patients or in the older ileal conduit patients. The oldest group of patients, our 80-year-olds, do show decreased in their physical functioning compared to the younger patients, but this is not actually even corrected for baseline. So this may represent just an age-matched drop. I think it's also important to remember that our patients are not static with respect to disease status after surgery. Surgery, these types of postoperative evaluations will take credit for everything that happens after surgery, including what happens with respect to disease recurrence. So you can see that by 12 months, that about 25% of the population here has already recurred. And again, on the far right side here, you can see the pattern of recurrences, the bulk of which have occurred within that 2-year period. So they'll be captured in the quality of life data. And so here's an example of the impact of a recurrence and subsequent treatment. So if you look at the first measured global quality of life after a recurrence has been identified, and you compare it to the worst quality of life ever measured in people who don't recur, there's about a 20 to 25 point difference in global quality of life. There is a significant hit that occurs from recurrence and subsequent treatment. This tends to get wrapped up into the overall data that you saw. I don't want to show the overall quality of life curves in the patients that don't recur, but you could imagine they look pretty good if that is measuring surgery's impact only. Now, it's not all roses. Clearly, there are some domains that don't recover. Sexual function is still an issue, and that will happen even more pronounced in the younger, healthier patients that come in with better function. But even the ileal conduit patients will report this. So what can we do better as surgeons? Well, we can do more nerve-sparing surgery. I see Mark Schoenberg out there. Mark, decades ago, I think, had written some nice data about doing nerve-preserving surgery in the cystectomy population. Techniques are similar to what we do for prostatectomy, and we know that they can work. So this is data that's that looked at patients with good erectile function, men in this situation coming into surgery, good erectile function who are able to have nerve-sparing surgery because of disease factors, and about 2/3 of those patients report no or mild erectile function afterwards. This data is not much different than what we see from the radical prostatectomy experience, okay? So for those patients that are reasonable to nerve-sparing or vaginal preservation in women, we need to be doing more of this. The other big hit that occurs is body image. This is not seen in patients with continent reconstructions, but we definitely see it when we hang bags on patients. We know that younger patients will have more body image concerns. Again, the younger patients are on the left side there. And when you look at urostomy scores across age groups, they skyrocket in younger patients, right? And this is a problem when you look at the distribution of types of diversions that are being done both in the United States and in other countries as well. But this will be probably one of the biggest disappointments in my career, is that blue line has really not increased over time. The blue line are the continent diversion group in the United States, which now is sustained below 10%. Less than 10% of patients undergoing a cystectomy receive a continent reconstruction, despite the fact that neobladders, for instance, have been around since the mid-80s in men and the early 90s in women. Even in countries that had a much higher rate of continent reconstruction, such as Germany, you're also beginning to see this trend where it's beginning to drop over time as well. Now, just to prove that this is not just a memorial event, I think this trial, which had been mentioned previously, does require a little bit of attention here. So this is the Cysto trial. This was a non-randomized trial that looked at quality of life endpoints in patients with non-muscle invasive disease who were going to undergo either bladder preservation and additional therapy or early radical cystectomy. And you could see that in general, the bladder sparing group was a little bit younger, as you would expect. The age distributions are listed there. But what I want to focus on, and I think this dropped a lot of jaws at the time that it was presented at the AUA, is that many of the quality of life parameters that were measured actually favored radical cystectomy. So when you look at physical functioning, global health, emotional functioning, depression measures, anxiety measures, they actually all favored cystectomy over the patients who kept their bladders in and underwent continuous intravesical therapies. Financial difficulties and financial toxicities were also noted to be in favor of cystectomy. And so the perception that we have that sparing the bladders is always better, I think from a quality of life standpoint, clearly the data would suggest otherwise. I think the benchmark has been set very high with respect to the cancer outcomes that we've achieved using this combined outcome. We all hope that with better systemic agents, we're going to be sparing more bladders safely. But I think one of the main issues here is that while we all got excited when the colorectal literature started showing that we were saving rectums with immunotherapy in a subset of patients, it's important to recognize that the biology of the organs are very different. So curing somebody with chemoradiation or checkpoint alone with rectal cancer, the risk of developing a de novo tumor in that rectum is less than 5%. We know that the urothelium, the natural history of that field defect is such that anywhere from 1/4 to 50%, depending on how long you follow patients, are going to develop more recurrences. And up to maybe 1/3 of those recurrences may be new muscle invasive recurrences. We will not catch every one of those at a curative stage. It just doesn't happen. And so these are only the long-term consequences we're going to be able to pick up with well-designed long-term studies. Okay. So I wanted to just put that out as a benchmark. This is kind of what we've achieved, and this maybe will dovetail into some of the bladder sparing talks that we have later on today as well. Okay. So I'm going to stop there.